Something happened at the Chinese Grand Prix sprint that Formula One hasn't seen in a long time.
A Ferrari driver crossed the finish line less than 7/10 of a second behind a dominant Mercedes, and the entire paddock went quiet. Not because the result was shocking, but because of what it revealed. How did Ferrari suddenly close a gap that looked enormous just one race ago? Why did Lewis Hamilton describe Mercedes' advantage with surgical precision, almost like he was confessing a secret? And is Ferrari's real problem something they can actually fix, or is it already too late in this championship fight? Let's rewind. Ferrari arrived in Shanghai under enormous pressure after Melbourne. The team had already shown flashes of genuine pace, but qualifying kept exposing the same wound. Every time the cars were pushed to their absolute single-lap limit, Mercedes pulled away on the straights like they were in a different category. Not slightly faster, significantly faster. And Ferrari couldn't explain it publicly. Until China. Here's where things start getting interesting. Before sprint qualifying even began, Ferrari made a decision that tells you everything about where they are as a team right now. They had brought a brand new rear wing to Shanghai, something so advanced internally they called it the Macarena wing. It showed up in Friday practice, gave the engineers the data they needed, and then it disappeared. Pulled from both cars before a single competitive lap. Hamilton confirmed it himself, a reliability concern, not ready to survive a full race weekend. But they rushed it there anyway. Why? Because Ferrari is gathering data at a pace that suggests they know exactly what they're chasing. And what they're chasing brings us to the detail that most people walked past this weekend. There was one specific thing Hamilton said after sprint qualifying that should have stopped everyone cold. A comment so technically precise, so quietly devastating, that it is essential. LY handed the paddock a map to Mercedes' advantage. We'll get to exactly what he said in a moment. But first, the sprint race itself. When the sprint lights went out, the easy story was already written. Mercedes on the front row, Ferrari on the second row, a 4/10 gap in qualifying, business as usual. Most people expected a controlled race where Russell and Antonelli managed the front while Ferrari settled for third and fourth. That's the obvious reading. And it was completely wrong. Charles Leclerc spent 19 laps hunting George Russell down. He crossed the line 0.674 seconds behind. Hamilton finished third. Ferrari outscored Mercedes in the sprint. Now here's where the simple explanation breaks down. Because if Ferrari's power unit is genuinely inferior on the straights, how does that result happen? The answer to that question is the entire story of this 2026 season so far. And that's where this gets really interesting. After sprint qualifying, Lewis Hamilton gave an interview that most coverage summarized in a single line. But when you actually listen to what he said, it reveals something profound about the 2026 regulations and why Mercedes are so far ahead of everyone in qualifying. He didn't just say Ferrari was losing time on the straights. He explained exactly why. And he used the words, less derating. Here's what that means. Under the 2026 rules, every team runs an active aerodynamic system. When drivers hit what's called straight mode, the front and rear wing flaps flatten simultaneously, cutting drag and releasing top speed. Every team does this. The difference is what happens in the milliseconds after that wing opens. Mercedes arrives at each straight with more battery charge than their rivals. When the deployment begins, they sustain full electrical power for longer, and critically, they derate significantly less at the end of the straight. Derating means losing electrical power before the braking zone. While Ferrari is already bleeding speed with their foot flat to the floor, Mercedes is still accelerating. That is not a small advantage. That is the advantage. Hamilton went further. He said this is something Mercedes were working on last year while everyone else was still focused on the old regulations. They started earlier. They understood the system's limits before anyone else did. And the result is a software and calibration advantage that isn't tied to physical hardware. It's tied to knowledge. McLaren runs the same Mercedes engine. They qualified nearly 9/10 slower than the factory team in Melbourne. The gap is in the software. And Ferrari have now said it out loud. Bell, if you're finding this breakdown useful, subscribe to F1 Unstoppable right now that we go deeper than the headlines. Every single race weekend. So what changes now that this is public? More than you might think. Ferrari didn't just identify the problem in Shanghai. They introduced a new MGUK software package targeting exactly the phase of the lap where their battery drains before the straights begin. The goal is to arrive at each straight with more charge, sustain deployment longer, and close the derating gap that hands Mercedes their qualifying advantage. That is not a vague upgrade direction. That is a precise engineering response to a precisely identified weakness. But there's a tension inside that update. Earlier versions of similar software in Bahrain made the Ferrari feel unstable through fast corners, a micro-nervousness that drivers had to manage through setup changes. Ferrari rebuilt those algorithms using real-world Shanghai data rather than simulation estimates. The tightrope between energy efficiency and car stability hasn't disappeared. They're just walking it more carefully. And while they walk it, the championship clock is ticking. There's also a date on the calendar that changes everything. June 1st. That's when the FIA's compression ratio rule change lands, stripping Mercedes of somewhere between 13 and 30 brake horsepower that they were never supposed to have. The FIA voted unanimously to remove it. That is not a small development. That is a regulatory intervention that reshuffles the entire power order mid-season. Ferrari know it's coming. Mercedes know it's coming. And both teams are building their season strategy around what happens after that moment. Right now, there are 3 ways this story develops over the next few races. The first scenario, Ferrari's new software package works faster than expected, closes the derating gap, and when the June 1st rule change strips Mercedes' horsepower advantage, the championship is genuinely open. 2 teams, 2 very different strengths, fighting race by race. That's the scenario Ferrari are building toward. The second scenario is more uncomfortable. Ferrari's software improvements work in race conditions, but the qualifying gap remains structural, built over years of earlier development work that a few updates can't replicate. In that world, Mercedes keeps banking front-row lockouts while Ferrari wins sprint points and challenges in races. A competitive year, but not a championship year. The points table tells the real story in that scenario by mid-season. The third scenario is the one no one inside the Ferrari garage wants to say out loud. The internal dynamics between Hamilton and Leclerc, already showing signs of friction in China, become a story of their own. 2 championship-caliber drivers sharing a car that doesn't yet have the qualifying pace to give both of them what they need. In Formula One, that combination has a history, and not always a comfortable one. So here's where we land. Ferrari have done something genuinely rare in Formula One. They've correctly diagnosed a rival's advantage, named it publicly, and already begun responding to it race by race. The sprint result in Shanghai wasn't just a good weekend. It was proof that in race conditions, the gap to Mercedes is not the same gap that shows up in qualifying. And that matters enormously for what comes next. But the real question is whether Ferrari can close that final margin before Mercedes' lead becomes uncatchable. Because identifying a problem and solving it are 2 very different things. And in this sport, the team that solves it first doesn't just win races, they win championships. If you made it this far, you already know Formula One is never just about speed. It's about strategy, pressure, and sometimes the kind of drama that unfolds behind the scenes. So now I'm curious, do you think Ferrari's software fix is enough to truly challenge Mercedes before June? Or is this a championship that's already decided? Let me know your thoughts in the comments.